my email, but you're saying you're still having trouble downloading it.
Yeah.
So look, please God, we'll get it all resolved. And Irene, I will definitely send you the whole pack.
Okay.
But today, are we, all right. So today, actually, I mean, these are my own notes, but I wanted to really conclude about, what was going on in different parts of, well, it's primarily Europe, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about just those Jews of North Africa. This won't be, as long a session, but just, don't forget, there already for hundreds of years had been Jews living in North Africa and establishing communities. And certainly when we talked about the Rif, who came from Fez, Morocco, and then eventually went to Spain. I guess he became more famous when he had moved to Spain, but he originally was a Moroccan Jew. So I just want to give an overall picture. What was life like for those Jews of Morocco in the medieval era? And I will focus in on two particular rabbonim from the latter part of this medieval period. And then we'll sort of conclude, what I have been teaching this past months, since November. And then I'll start giving that overview. Okay, so if you could all
Can I ask you a question before you start?
Before I begin, okay.
So I got an email that said you can edit. I don't know why
you're saying that. I don't know why it's coming that way. Did you get the thing that
I got them? Yeah, I got it. And the last page had like an unfinished sentence at the end.
No. Then I sent out another one. You never got the next packet of material?
I got something that said you can edit this.
No, I don't. You know what? I don't know why you're having problems. I'll have Joel try to reconfigure it, and so that you will receive it.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry.
So I just have a favor now. If you could all just mute yourselves, all right? So I won't hear any background noise. That would be great. Okay, Irene, you also have to mute. Okay. Terrific. Okay. So again, we're talking today about the Jews of North Africa. And hopefully you can all visualize. I don't have a map to show you, but you can all visualize what North Africa looks. And we're talking about Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. Those three countries in particular. Again, it's always unclear, when did the Jews originally come to settle in these various areas? Do they go back all the way to the time period of Shlomo HaMelech? We do know that Shlomo, with the help of Hiram of Tyre, of Lebanon, these are Phoenicians, they did engage in trade throughout the Mediterranean basin. But were there permanent settlements, maybe temporary settlements? Unclear. For sure, but by Roman days, we know the Jews are living in this area, just as we know that they are establishing early, some very small, tiny communities already, even, throughout the southern European area, et cetera, et cetera. So they're obviously also in North Africa. Again, those Jews who lived in the mountains, the Atlas Mountains, so they claim that they go back all the way to time period of Shlomo HaMelech, possibly, who knows. But during the time period of the Amoraim, again, these are the rabbis of the Gemara, so they felt that if there were any Jews who were living in that part of the world, that they really were rather far removed from Judaism. And obviously they hadn't kept up their connection with the rest of the Jewish world. But I think this is interesting. And again, perhaps because had been some early settlements of Jews in these areas. So there's a feeling that among the Berbers, not all of them, but among some of the Berber tribes, some of them were practicing certain customs of the Jews. I don't know that they really converted to Judaism, but they definitely had certain Jewish practices in their homes. And this has also come down to us through history. So in the 600s, we're talking about this is again before the Arabs totally conquered that whole part of the world, North Africa, that there was again a descendant of those earlier Jews, who was living among these Berber tribes. They actually, one of the key people who led them in the revolt or attempted revolt against the invading Arabs was a Jewish princess, and her name was Kahina. And that has come down in history, so I guess she did exist. Interesting, her name, Kahina, her name was like Dia Kahina. I don't know, was she from a Kohen family? You know, I'm not sure. I didn't see anything further about her, but I found that so interesting. Whatever, you know, the Arabs overrun it, you know, it becomes all Muslim, you know, from this time period. And they say that even she had a son, and that son converted to Islam. Okay, let's go on. Okay, so then we go into the time period. Well, I have to backtrack. So even slightly before the Arabs come in, so remember some of the Christians had come in, the Visigoths, you know, they conquered these areas, especially like in Spain. Remember how terrible conditions were for those Jews living in Spain. So some Jews actually left Spain at that point to cross the Straits of Gibraltar, and they go to settle in Morocco. And eventually then, of course, with the Arab conquest, so more Jews will now come from points further east, meaning like Iraq, like Buffalo, you know, and they will eventually filter in and, you know, add to whatever nascent Jewish communities have already been established, you know, in Morocco. Okay. So slowly, they're going to grow and build. By and large, those Muslim caliphs, I pronounce it, you know, who ruled there were tolerant towards the Jews. You know, every once in a while you would get somebody who wasn't so, but by and large it was pretty good. And Fez in particular, which becomes the capital of Morocco, and there the Jewish community will really expand. But then, just as we had learned, and we talked about the Jews of Spain, that the Almohads, right, had rose to power, and they took over major portions of Muslim Spain, and of course that northern part of Africa, Morocco, and they were very intolerant, right? And they were the ones, remember, who said to the Jews in Spain, it affected obviously the Jews in Morocco as well, that either you convert to Islam or you will be killed. All right, so obviously many opted to convert. This is around the same time period that the Rambam's family is going to leave southern Spain. They will go to northern Spain for a short time, and that obviously points further east. Okay, there were some very famous from an earlier time period. We'll review them, actually, because we're going to learn about them, and they were from the 10th century. There were some very famous Jewish grammarians who originally come from Morocco, but they eventually will find their way to Spain, and they are very famous for giving us many of the laws of Dikduk that we have down to this day. And then I mentioned already the Rif. This is Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi. He has the name Alfasi because he comes from Fez, Morocco. He, already rose to become a great scholar while in North Africa, but he eventually will go to Spain because these are the main centers of Judaism, of Torah learning, are in Spain at this time period. And then we're talking about the 11th century, and that's when he goes. Okay, then we go into the period of the Almohads, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, I did this. Okay, and just see what else I wanted to tell you. Again, under the Almohads, you know, sometimes things were better, sometimes things were worse, you know, went back and forth. But unfortunately, there were many, many forced conversions. There were also massacres. Obviously, you did not agree to accept Islam as your religion, right? That was what they said, you know, either you're going to be killed, or I guess there was always a possibility to going into exile and leaving, right? Which is not such an easy thing to do. But some do leave, and then they go ultimately to Spain, but they're going to go now further north. They're going to Christian Spain. Okay. In 1269, the Almohads were defeated, and then the succeeding dynasties were much more favorable to the Jews. I'm talking about now, I'm back in North Africa. All right. Then remember, we had learned in Spain how conditions get worse and worse with the Reconquista and with the Christians moving southward, you know, and ultimately conquering more and more Arab lands. And then there were these terrible, terrible massacres that happened in the year 1391 in Spain, where really multitudes, probably thousands of Jews did convert at that point to Christianity. But those obviously who did, did not opt not to do that, they fled. And many of them do find their way, again, crossing now the Straits of Gibraltar the opposite direction, and they're going to go and settle in North Africa. And then, of course, in 1492, when there is that edict of expulsion, well, we know the majority of the Jews left and they went to live in Portugal. A certain sizable number went further south, right, and went to live in Morocco in particular. I mean, we'll learn about Algeria as well, but Morocco seemed to be the larger of the Jewish communities there. Unfortunately, even though they were permitted to come in, many of them, the accommodations for them were terrible initially. Some of them, were just given, actually made me think, unfortunately, of, when the opposite, when a lot of those Jews from North Africa came to live in Eretz Israel, right? And they lived, in these horrible, like, tent cities, it was really under terrible conditions. The same thing happened when they came from Spain to North Africa. They were living just openly in the fields. I mean, just think about those refugee camps, right? Like that are in Syria. I mean, the sanitation is, and you can imagine, really hundreds and hundreds of people died as a result. They felt threatened. There were animals, would come in, I don't know, jackals, maybe larger animals, whatever. It's pretty terrible. And unfortunately, some of them, the conditions were so bad. I mean, I'm sure that the Jews who lived there at the time were trying their best, but they weren't that large a community. I don't know how wealthy they were either. So it sort of was, this is how they were being treated by the government in Morocco. And some of them actually made the decision, even though that means they would have to convert to Christianity then, but some of them did return to Spain, all right? Then it's the 16th century, so we're talking about more to the 1500s, it was actually that Jewish community there really basically falls apart. All right. And just in case you've heard this word, so the Jews lived in a separate section called the Mela, which is like, the Arabic word for the Jewish ghetto. Okay, so now I'll talk a little about Algeria, somewhat similar fate to Morocco. Same thing, very much up until 1269 when the Almohads, are defeated. These two countries share a similar fate. And again, that area, again, you might have heard the term, it's called the Maghreb, which means the West, all right? So that includes Morocco and Algeria, and spelled Maghreb, the Maghreb. And whatever the fate was for Morocco becomes the fate, also of the Jews of Algeria. 1391, also people are coming to live there. We will learn, I'm going to talk to you about two key Rabbanim. They were already men of renown in Spain, but they don't go to Morocco. Remember, I told you the conditions aren't so great in Morocco. They actually go to and settle in Algiers, all right? And I'll talk to you more about them. One is called the Rivash, talk about him, Rabbi Yitzhak ben Sheshet Perfet. And the other is, he's known as Rabbi Shimon ben Tzemach, but he's also called Rabbi Shimon Duran, and his name is Rashbatz. But I'm going to talk about those two individual subjects. So I don't have any major Rabbanim, except for the Rif from an earlier time period, who came from Morocco, went from Morocco to Spain. Now I'm going to talk, when it comes to Algeria, two Rabbanim from Spain who will go to settle in Algiers. All right. Okay. Obviously, in 1492, same fate. They also go to settle and live there. All right. Let me make sure I've covered that properly. Okay. Now, just a little bit about Tunisia, which is more to the east of those two countries. Again, they go back to ancient times. There were some Jews. There's an island called Jerba. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. It's spelled D-J-E-R-B-A. It's an island off of the Tunisian coast. And they really feel that Jews were settling there already from the time period of Shlomo HaMelech. And then there's another also ancient town called Cyrene. That's actually Libya. That's Cyrenaica. And they definitely had during the time period already of the second Beit HaMikdash. So this would be after Shlomo's time period, but it's still a pretty ancient community. And that from the time period of again the Bayit Sheni that they were establishing there again, but that's Cyrene or Cyrenaica. Okay, but then there are others. There are other already in the time period of the Amoraim. So we're talking about the time period of the Gemara. The Jews settled in Tunisia, but in Carthage, ancient Carthage, which you probably learned in general history. And some of them also can probably settle there even at an earlier period. I don't know, Shlomo's time period or the Second Temple era. It's a little unclear exactly when they came. This is interesting. A number of the Jewish slaves who were captured in Israel, right, under Titus, they were brought to Carthage to help build up that community. Then as the Arabs again moved in, and the Caliphate it's in charge, first it's Umayyad, then later it's Abbasid, whatever, that they're retreated pretty fairly. They did fairly well under Muslim rule. And then until we get until the period of about the mid-11th century. Now there's another famous town area there called Kairouan that was founded in the year 670 by the Arabs, and that became a very important center of Jewish scholarship apparently. And they kept up correspondence with the Gaonim living in Bavel during that time period. And even some of the teachers of the Rif himself, remember the one I told you from Fez, Morocco, who then goes to live in Spain, that he learned for a period of time, under these rabbis in ancient either Carthage or Kairouan. All right, where the Almohads obviously covered a huge territory. They obviously suffered during that time period. But then in 1228, whoever was the Tunisian governor at that time, he revolts against them, and then their lot becomes neither better nor worse than anybody else in any of those other North African countries. We have no record, though, of Spanish Jews coming to settle there. They seem to have gone mostly to Morocco or Algeria, and we don't have any great scholars, who come out. Up front, settle in this area. I mean, in case you don't know this, eventually, this country, years later, we come under the rule of Italy. And that's why a lot of Tunisian Jews or Tripoli Jews really, will eventually, you'll find they live today in Italy, but because it had once been under Italian rule. Okay, so I just want to tell you about those few countries in North Africa. And now I just want to talk to you again about those two key Rabbanim who leave Spain, not that they want to. They're going to both leave after the massacres of 1391, and they're going to go and settle in Algiers and make quite a name. Now, one of them, the Rivash, was already a well-known scholar in Spain. He doesn't come to live in Algiers, so he's into his mid-60s. Whereas the Rashbatz comes, he's only a 30-year-old man. So I'd say the bulk of his career is actually in Algiers, but the Rivash, so I've noticed in different sources, they are listed as Spanish scholars, right? And I could say in the Rivash's case, I definitely, can see that. But even Rashbas, he's still considered, I guess because he did come from Spain, he grew up there. He certainly grew to manhood there and developed a name for himself and was a Rav in Spain. So even though he comes when he's 30 years old, he's still always called, that he's Spanish. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the Rivash. He lived from 1326 to 1407. So I'm telling you, he's not going till after those massacres of 1391. Doesn't live in Algiers, all that long. He originally came from Barcelona. I guess he was born there, and was, I guess, educated in Barcelona. That's from the Ramban and then the Rashba, there were yeshivas there. It was a great place of learning. But he got a position in Saragossa to be the Rav there. And then from Saragossa, he also went to Valencia But then those horrible, horrible massacres of 1391 occurred. I told you, like thousands, I mean, tens of thousands. I don't know how many, I saw one source said even up to 100,000 Jews were killed, whatever. It was a huge, huge number of Jews. And of course, and many opted to convert at that time. And these, they added now to the numbers of conversos that already were living there. And now that number is just going to grow more and more. And so you can imagine that's why when the Inquisition will be instituted, which is, again, it's not until 1480, right? Officially 1478, but it's more 1480 and 1483 with Torquemada, and the oppression became, so awful. But those conversos, they were probably a goodly number living secretly as Jews. They were, and this is what the Inquisition was trying to ferret out. Okay. All right, so again, back to the Rivash. So the massacres of 1391 occurred. Conditions are horrible in Spain, and so he leaves and he settles in Algiers. And there he's appointed the Rav of the community. Again, he already had established a reputation. He was a well-known scholar. Now, apparently there was already a Spanish refugee living in Algiers at that time. I couldn't find what his name was. Maybe it's better not Lashon Hara, all right. But there was another person there who opposed his appointment. And at the same time, when the Rivash, again, this renowned scholar, well-known individual, it was already a mature man, when he would give, let's say, halachic decisions, this other guy would start giving opposing halachic decisions and viewpoints. And a lot of the people in the community actually wanted the Rivash to put this other individual into cherem, but I guess he felt that was very unpleasant. He didn't want to do so. But apparently a ship arrives in the port. It was coming from Majorca. Majorca is an island off the coast of Spain, and it had apparently 45 conversos on board, and they wanted permission to settle, in Algeria, and be in Algiers as a port, and establish, setting up housing, whatever. And this other man, the man who was opposed to the Rivash, and every time he made a halakha decision, he came out with an opposing one. So this man then goes to the governor of Algiers, and he tells him, don't permit this ship to dock, and if anybody, other refugees want to come, don't allow them, to land. So at this point, the Rivash feels he has no, alternative, and he puts this man into cherem. And apparently cherem was really observed in those days. I mean, I guess you could say it today too, but I don't know who would listen to it. But in those days, it was taken very seriously. It had zero to do with the individual who was put into cherem. Okay. Now, so how's he going to guarantee his position now? So he, in turn, I don't think he necessarily wanted to do this, but he felt he had no choice in the matter. He now also goes to the government and asks now, though, that he should be officially instated as Rav of the community, but with the governor's stamp. All right. It makes me think a little bit in England, the chief rabbi, who's he the chief rabbi of? You think of all the Jews are following him, they're not. But it's like an official position of so to speak, dates back to days when royalty had more power. So just like this Archbishop of Canterbury, he's the head of the Anglican Church, the Church of England. So there's also has to be a chief rabbi who's in charge of all of the Jews. I don't know if in the Muslim community there's a comparable figure. Any case, so again, he feels, he's got to totally squelch, that there shouldn't be anybody else who's going to rise up in opposition to him. So he turns to the government that they should give him the official sanction. Yes, indeed, you are the chief rabbi of Algiers. Okay. But I will talk more about him, but the Rashbats, all right, who's a much younger man, who's now currently also living in Algiers. He's also come after 1391. He doesn't like this idea, and he criticizes the Rivash for doing this, should not get involved with the government, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, but I'll talk to you a little bit more about him in a bit. Again, he was definitely, through his lifetime, he's considered the leading rabbinic authority of that age. certainly, I mean, already has a reputation, obviously, living in Spain, but he will continue, the great respect that was due him will be also in Algeria. He wrote a lot of responsa, and you could he obviously had a background in philosophy. Remember, the study of philosophy starts with Spain, then eventually goes to Provence. Then there's a whole controversy with the Rambams, whether one should study philosophy or not. But he was opposed to the study of Kabbalah, talking about the Rivash right now. He also wrote a Torah commentary and also commentary on several of the tractates, different volumes of the Gemara as well. And upon his death, I think this is a custom. It was this Ali Saba or something or other. I don't know. The Moroccan, Algerians would go to his place of burial at his tomb site, and pray there, well, especially on his yard site. I think that other individual I'm referring to, that's a much later date, time period. Okay, now I'll tell you a little bit more about this Rosh Batz. Okay, he lived from 1361 to 1444. And his regular name is Rabbi Shimon Duran. And there's another Duran, if you've ever come across it, but this is the main one. He actually came from an very old Provençal family. And in fact, he was a descendant of the Rambam, and he also was a relative of Ralbag. Okay. And again, I'm going to review all these people and when exactly they lived. He received his Talmudic instruction plus knowledge of sciences and mathematics, and he eventually earned his livelihood as a physician. And it's so interesting. Many of the Rabbanim from this entire, specifically more from in the Spanish, Jewish community, so many of them did go into the field of medicine. Okay, apparently he was born though in Mallorca, Spain. Again, that's an island off the coast. But the rest of his family, they all fled to Algiers again after those massacres of 1391. The Rivash was very happy to welcome him, help him get settled in the community. And in fact, when the Rivash passes, he's recognized as the greatest scholar of the land, and he becomes the successor to the Rivash. But he accepts the position with a very opposite request. He doesn't want any part of the government to give sanction, to his. He doesn't want them to officially confirm him, and this because he had always opposed the Rivashes going to the government, for official, approval that, oh yes, indeed, you are the head of the Jewish community here. He felt that it was improper for the Jewish people to have anything to do with the non-Jewish rulers and to all get them involved. And, I guess he could see that perhaps down the line that this could lead to terrible repercussions. So I didn't want, any involvement and certainly no sanction from the non-Jewish government. Apparently he was a prolific writer. He wrote about 14 different works. And even he lived to be quite an old man, in his 80s. And even, in his latter years, he was still continuing to writing things. And he actually, at that point, he came out with a book on the laws of Chametz and a commentary on the Haggadah as well. His most famous work, which is a collection of his various responsa, is called, that's how he has the name that he does, is called Tashabat, because it's Teshuvot Shimon ben Tzemach. Okay. It was published in 3 volumes. It contains close to 800 responsa. So it says you could tell, if one should go through and read these responsa, it obviously discusses all sorts of questions on many points of law in Judaism, but it also sheds light then, based on the types of questions that are coming in and his responses to them, it's a reflection of what life is like for those Jews living in Spain and then in North Africa. What's troubling them, what's bothering them, where do they need a Pesach Halacha on? So it's always very interesting. He was of the opinion the Rambam had said, and this was, as we had learned this once, it was for really centuries accepted practice that even if a man should be the Rav of a community, he still had to earn his income separately. That merchants, agro, like Rashi, was a vintner. Rambam, of course, what was a physician. You saw several of them actually became physicians. But listen, times change. Already in Ashkenaz, this was already, the idea that, again, that a Rav could not earn an income, through the community, but he had to find a means of earning a living, on his own. So at this point, he said, no, from now on, just like it's changed in Ashkenaz, the whoever was the Rav of the community would receive a salary from the community. So in other words, he wouldn't have to spend his time worrying where his income is going to come from. And also it takes him away from communal affairs, learning, that the income would be provided by the community itself. I have to tell you, when my father first became rabbi, so this was, I think, in 1932. So my parents would always describe that. They said it was the height of the Depression. So literally, they would pass a hat in shul, so everybody could put in whatever coins. I mean, and that was my father's salary. That's how they paid him initially. This is before he was married. I'm sure things changed by that time. All right, so he does receive a salary. He also wrote commentaries himself to different tractates in the Gemara. And he also wrote a book just on the 613 mitzvot that are mentioned in the Torah. And he agreed with Rambam's analysis of what are those 613 commandments. There's a discrepancy among some Rabbonim as to which mitzvot should be included in that number or not. And apparently he also wrote some liturgical hymns, and then he also wrote a guide to kosher slaughter. Okay, so I just gave you a little bit, so you have a little bit of a feel for what it was like for those Jews living in North Africa. All right, and you can see scholarship was good, going on apace there, as it's come to now an end in Spain, unfortunately. Okay, so now, those of you who hopefully have it, so first I wanted to show you what this is. So this I got from a book called the Rishonim, and it was a chart there, but it's very hard to read it, very small print. And it's divided in four things. It talks about the Sephardic lands, France and Germany, Provence, and Italy, and it goes century by century. So then I took the chart, and then I transposed it to this. Okay, so some of you have received these. Okay, I will try to make sure, when I finish the class, just get back on and tell me again so I know who exactly does have the full set. The full set is, I don't know, it's about 12 to 14 pages long. All right. But you're happy. The ones I initially sent out, cover, they're five to 6 pages. I don't remember. Okay. But I started off a little bit with Spain in the 10th century because there were already Jews living there in the 900s. And I just mentioned some of their names when I was talking about the Jews of North Africa, because it actually said some of these people, right, they had come from North Africa originally. So both of the ones I want to mention to you are grammarians, right, and from them we have a lot of our laws of dikduk. I mean, you might have hated learning dikduk, but it is because of these men that we have a format for studying Hebrew grammar. They actually disagreed with one another. They had big arguments, but I'll mention their names. Okay, so one of them is Menachem ibn Saruk. And he wrote a book called the Machberet. Now, Machberet means like a notebook, but that's what he called. That was like one of the earliest. There already was some in the Gaonic period, but this is the first one now talking about in Europe itself, in Western Europe. And again, it's a Hebrew language dictionary. The man who opposed him, who came, remember, originally from Fez, Morocco, then he actually studied in Baghdad. Because remember, at this point, this is still the Gaonic period. When I talk about 10th century, so there's not as much learning going on in Europe at this point. The the great Talmudic academies, mostly Sur and Pumbedisa, they are in, they moved eventually to Baghdad, but they're known by their original locations in Iraq. So again, this is the end of the Gaonic period, to be about the last century and a half of the Gaonic period. And so the great scholarship, the great learning is going on in Bavel, right? Historic Bavel. It's mostly Iraq, partially is Iran. Okay, so the under individual gain, his name is Donash ibn Labrat. He disagreed, whether a root word, the shoresh, is it 3 letters? Is it 2 letters? Whatever. They had a big dispute. They don't think they liked one another. And so this Donash ibn Labrat eventually comes and he settles in Cordova. And Cordova, by the way, is the same town from which the Rambam comes from. Okay. Then there's just one other person I'm going to mention to you, just because he's such a famous figure from this time period, the 10th century. He is not considered a scholar. He was a great diplomat. And his name was Chasdai ibn Shaprut. He actually wrote to power. He was the court physician to the Sultan, the Caliph at that time. And we can say, so we're starting with the end of that 10th century. This is the beginning of the golden age of Spanish Jewry. And it's going to go through, let's say, the 13th century. By the time we come to the 14th century, things get really bad. But 11th century, 12th century, maybe parts of the 13th century, these are the heydays, right? The 13th century, I could say, is already what we would call not the golden age, more like the silver age. Okay, now coming out to the 11th century, now we have a lot of different scholars. Again, the Jews are leaving. This is the end of the Gaonic period, and many Jews, and times are troubled, in Bavel, many Jews are now finding their way. Now remember, they might be small, but there already are established communities, right, in Europe. We're talking about mostly Western Europe. Jews are not yet in Eastern Europe. I mean, it could be tiny pockets, but that will be at a much later time period. They're going to North Africa, they're going to Spain, some will be going to France into parts of northern Germany, and there are, of course, Jews in Italy as well. Okay, so here are the few people from the 11th century Spain. So the first person, again, not because of any writings that he did, or scholarship, but just because he becomes one of the key leaders of the Jewish community, and that's Shmuel HaNagid. And again, we're talking about 11th century, and he rose to power. He became the vizier to the king of Granada. Granada is, again, that southernmost part of Spain. He's what will become later known more in Western Europe. Certainly in Germany, you'll hear about the court Jew, the person, the Jew who represents the Jewish community. He's like the buffer between the main Jewish community and the ruling powers that be at that time. And of course, it is a wealthy Jew. And this is how he curries favor with the ruler. Okay, this is part of it's the end of the Abbasid dynasty, and now the Berbers are going to come in and rule over, and this is going to, become a stronghold for them. Now, one of the key people from this time period is a very famous philosopher, and his name is Rabbi Bachya ben Yosef ibn Pekuda, and he wrote the very famous Rechovot HaLevavot, called Duties of the Heart, and it's still studied to this day. And he wrote it in part. He had already been exposed to Rabbi Sadia Gaon. Rabbi Sadia Gaon is from several centuries prior to him, living in Babylonia, and he wrote a book of philosophy called Emunot V'Deot. All right, but this is now Ibn Pekuda's his way of viewing, and he stresses key elements that he sees, within Judaism. Again, it's a major philosophical work, still studied to this day. Chovot HaLevavot. Another individual from this time period who was famous as a poet. He's also considered a philosopher, and that's Ibn Gabirol. And if you should ever have recourse to go to see a book of Spanish Jewish poetry, you will definitely see his name. He wrote very beautiful, flowing poetry, and that's what he is known as. And one more person who also added to our field of diktuk is Yonah ibn Ganach. Okay, so I've already, different people, different fields, philosophers, poets, grammarians, but now we're going to come to the same individual whose name I have already mentioned to you, who was a preeminent halachas, a Talmud scholar, and that's Rabbi Yitzchak Alfatsi, the Rif. Okay, it's called the Rif. It's Reish Yud Pei Sofit. All right, and he lived from 1013 to 1105. Interesting. He dies around the same time that Rashi does. All right, so he's just, if you can visualize, it's the Rif living in Spain, it's the Rashi living up in France, Alsace-Lorraine, on that German border. And he is famous. Remember, he's the man I told you who came originally from Morocco, right? But then went to live in Spain, and that's where he grows to the heights of his scholarship, living in Spain. He wrote a very famous work called Sefer HaHalachot, and it becomes the model for how to organize that whole compendium of Jewish law. All the mitzvot, you're already starting in the Gaonic period. Just picture, the Gemara is basically a book of discussions. It does not tell you what the halacha is. It tells you, Rabbi so-and-so says such and so, Rabbi so, this says so-and-so, somebody else has a slightly different opinion. That's it. You don't necessarily know. I'm sure the Rabbanim living at that time period knew what law they ultimately followed, but it wasn't written down. In the Gaonic period, there are going to be several Rabbanim there who are now going to make the attempt to cull from the Talmudic discussions and now publish and let it be known to the Jewish community what is the halacha, okay? And some of them would emphasize certain works, some others. All right. Now, the Rif, though, again, because of his, he was considered this brilliant scholar. So his work will now become one of the key ones, right, into the so-called modern age, of that time period. And again, his book is called Sefer HaHalachot. And for example, like when the Rambam will write his Mishnah Torah, he's going to study the Rif Sefer HaHalachot for ideas, how to organize material, what are the key halachot, and in what order should they be presented. They're all going to have, this is all going to lead up to the time period of the Shulchan Aruch, but that's much, much later, okay? But you have to begin somewhere. So these are individuals who are making the attempt to codify Jewish law, okay? And again, he bases it all according to the Talmudic text, so it's probably written in the order of the various tractates, which is not necessarily the ideal way of doing it, but this was the Rif's approach, how to organize the material at that time period. Okay, so now we're going to talk to France, what's going on at that same time period. So the first person, before Rashi, obviously we know Rashi is the giant of this time period, but early in the century was a great rabbinic figure whose name was Rabbeinu Gershom. He's called Me'or HaGolah, right, the light of the exile. Obviously, he's a great Talmudic scholar. People would turn to him for explanations of the halacha. He was considered like the preeminent scholar of Ashkenaz. This is the beginning of the Ashkenazic Jewish community. All right. Now there already had been some scholars living in France prior to Rabbeinu Gershom. They were part of this Calonimus family, which had come originally from Italy. And Charlemagne himself, was a man greatly interested in scholarship. And so he actually invited some members of the Calonimus family to settle in France. And, so there's always, beginning somewheres of Jewish learning, but again, the first great scholar will be this Rabbeinu Gershom, okay? He's the one who put out actually a cherem. Remember, I told you in those days people did follow a cherem. This is not to excommunicate a particular person, but cherem on certain types of practices. And this is what he's so famous for. So he had that prohibition against polygamy. Up until then, well, and still in the Jewish, Arab world, the Muslim world, people were taking more than one wife. But he made the decision, from now on in the Ashkenazi Jewish community, you can only have one wife. should there be a divorce, it could only proceed if the wife consents to it. I mean, now we have the opposite problem if the husband doesn't, give the get. But here it was a protection for the woman. A man could say, well, I'm tired of that old hag. Let's get rid of her. I'll take another wife. So it could only, again, the get would only be sanctioned, right, if the woman agreed to it. He also, again, because already, in this time period, some people, for whatever reason, try to better themselves economically. Some people were converting, but not because they truly wanted to. So, he said, you have to re-accept these people. I mean, they have to obviously show proof that they are sincerely, want to be re-accepted by the Jewish community. But he says, but this is part of his major way of thinking, and becomes a law that, yes, you have to accept these people back. And apparently they did not have to, so to speak, re-enter. They didn't have to like go to the mikveh again. They didn't have to do all the processes when a convert becomes Jewish again. It was like obviously proven that they in fact had always been Jews and somehow perhaps secretly also were practicing Jewish law. And also this is very famous from that time period, and this was important because of the trade and commerce that was going throughout, especially that whole Mediterranean area, that if somebody would receive a letter, it is against the law to open up that letter and read it if it's addressed to somebody else. So it's a very important thing. So I sometimes have to think, if somebody comes to my husband, am I allowed to open it up? By right, you should not. Only he should open it up. Okay. And of course, and the giant, right, who will have such a far-reaching effect on Jews everywhere in the world is Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki, who comes primarily from Troyes, T-R-O-Y-E-S, France. He had learned Rabbeinu Gershom lived actually in Mainz, Germany. Again, this is, so you picture, talking about the Alsace-Lorraine, that's northeastern part of France, that's Rashi. And just a little over the border, where the Rhine River is, first of all, there was no France and Germany per se in those days, so it kind of flowed more easily. And those very famous communities along the Rhine River. So, because that's where Rabbeinu Gershom was. Rashi went to learn there at his great yeshiva and then he comes back and he sets up his own yeshiva. And he is considered the father of the commentators. Many, many people will follow after him, but he is the easiest to understand. It's like a pleasure to learn Rashi. Of course, we know him as women primarily because he was, he wrote a commentary on the whole Tanakh. It's not just Chumash. I mean, mostly a child begins learning, Rashi and Chumash, but he did it over the entire Tanakh. What a brilliant, brilliant man this was. And plus he wrote a commentary on except for I think a few tractates, but with the bulk of the Gemara. I'm astounded truly at his brilliance and what he did. And look at what an early age this is. So he's the first person, to imagine the patience to cull through all the existent works, to remember, well, there's something very similar, in another sefer, or I am truly in awe of his brilliance. And it's thanks to Rashi that the study of Tanakh and or the Gemara becomes understandable, to the masses of the Jewish people, because you can't just read the text without fully understanding it. So, again, he is the beginning, the most famous commentary of all time. All right. And again, this is going to be the beginning of the development, the flourishing of Ashkenazic Jewry. All right. I just want to mention one other individual. I think I'll conclude with that. And that's in Provence. And Rashi does mention this man's name. His name is Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan. He obviously loved Midrash, which is what Rashi liked. So he sometimes will quote Rabbi Moshe Hadarshan, with his explanation of a particular phrase. He also obviously was a Talmudist. They all studied. At this point, the Gemara, the Talmud has already been brought to Western Europe, all right, or obviously already in that prior century. It's now been proliferated every Jew, and any scholar will, besides obviously always to study Tanakh, but they already are studying, in the yeshivot, they are studying the Gemara. That is what they are doing, at this, starting with this time period. And apparently he also wrote, put together some anthology of his various midrashim. Okay, so next time we'll do the 11th century. Listen, if I can't finish it all next week, so when we start the class again, in the fall, so I'll just pick up, wherever we are. But at least we're up to the 11th century. Next week, we'll for sure do the 11th and 12th. If you have time, hopefully we'll do the 13th. But you should save these things ultimately, because as they say, you should go someplace and you hear a lecture and somebody says, so-and-so, you say, oh, I know where he, where he lived and when he lived. So I always like to know things like that. I think it really adds to your knowledge. So be well.
I just wanted to say that
Yes.
the printing press wasn't even invented until
No.
1440. So when you talk about all of this, we have to realize it's all
More to 1500. A lot of printing thing really comes from the 1500s. Everything is handwritten.
handwritten.
I mean, the Gemara is handwritten. I mean, can you imagine that? Just unbelievable. And either, I told you, I'm not sure, I have to look this up. Originally, everything was in scrolls, just like our Torah is a scroll. But at a certain point, they started putting it in the book form. It's called the codex. So you would turn like the pages of a book. So obviously, I think it would be easier to find something. You have to go rolling something. But everything is. Can you imagine how precious it was if if you were privileged enough to own, one of these documents? I mean, who could have been able to personally own like a whole set of Gemaras? I mean, that would have been impossible. So obviously the yeshivot had them. I'm trying to remember, I have to backtrack. There was one Rav who had in his yeshiva, he had 60, preeminent students, and he made each one of them learn a particular section of the Gemara, so that if a question would come up, we could turn to Baruch, what does it say in Bava Kama? Or if Shmuel, what does it say in Sanhedrin? Because it was like impossible. First of all, they couldn't personally own all these things. So I'm sure the yeshivot had full copies, but just how precious. And they were written originally on like animal skin. Then it goes to vellum. I'm not sure exactly 100%. Even the earliest, because I owned from my Zeta, I used to collect some of these old Sfarim. So I have things printed in the 1500s in Venice. Actually, I gave it to my son Sholom. I hope he's taking good care of them. And at first I thought that they were vellum. They're thick. They're very thick, and the books are like thick, like this. But I took it in. Actually, I went to the University of Rochester to do their manuscript department, and there was a woman there who she said no. She said it is a paper. It was paper. It was not on parchment, but it was very, very thick in those days. And it was what we own. It's a Tanakh. I have it. They must have been from different time periods, because one's Torah, one's Nevi'im, one's Ketuvim. Each one's a big fat book. But it was interesting, as I say, that because I thought for sure it was some sort of parchment because of the way it felt. But she said, no, it actually is paper. But again, from the 1500s, they were printed in Venice. So I think that's something quite extraordinary. You have to take very good care of things like that, to preserve them, through the centuries. What's most interesting, if you open up the cover, you can see there all the people for over the centuries who owned that particular volume wrote their names in it.
Oh, wow.
And once in a while, I see a Christian name. I can tell that they somehow was in their position and then came back to be owned by Jews. So just quite fascinating. So listen, I have, most of your things. I will send you. Wait, who did not receive the big thing? The one that's like the 12, 13 pages. Just tell me so I have to read it. But okay. Right, Irene, I know, and Karen. Everybody else.
I got it in two separate parts.
Yes, right.
But I tried printing, and
you can't
came out like 2 pages on one I don't understand why.
Listen, I don't know either. I will try, have Joel see if he can figure it out.
I will try and print them.
my
I'll
very
see if I can
best. All
print
right.
them. I don't know.
I am talking to somebody. It says KAANC's iPad. Who was that? Do you hear me? You're,
No,
I
not me.
hear you, but
Still
it's not
muted.
me.
yeah, no,
It
I
looks
know.
like Khan. Looks like Khan. The last
Yeah,
name.
but I don't know
Khan.
who that is, and that person could unmute themselves. I could see them, and they could tell me because I haven't sent that particular individual, so I don't know who you are. Hopefully, they're hearing me. I mean,
Right.
they've been here the whole time, but I'm not sure who it is. Whatever. Hopefully, between now and then,
You
if you
know
haven't,
who TE is? TE?
I don't mine just says KAHNC's.
And another one says TE.
Yeah, but I know who that is.
Oh.
That's somebody who lives down here.
Khan, I would think Khan is the last.
That's Toby. That's somebody, Toby Elof. I know who
I
Toby
would
is.
think
Correct,
Khan
I'm
is,
here.
Khan is the last name. And
Yeah, but there's one more person on who has not
Right.
unmuted themselves. Maybe they walked out of the room. I mean, I don't know.
Right.
I don't know who it is. Whatever. If they should be listening, you have to tell me, send me your email so I can try and forward to you the entire, document. So I think,
I
Thank
gave
you.
Mrs. Morris.
yes.
I think I gave you my email address last week. I'm
Right.
just
I did.
Deb Wilk
Receive
18,
anything. I did.
Deb Wilk 18 at AOL.com.
I
Did you
did
send it?
send you. Did you? Yes, I did send you something.
When did you send it? Because I look at my
I sent
email.
it in 2 packets. I sent the initial one. The initial one has this chart plus 5 pages of this. Then I finished doing this. Took me a lot of hours to put it
I'm
together.
sure.
I
I'm
did
sure.
this, and I sent the entire packet from the beginning all over again.
Right. Do you know, have you any idea like when you sent it? Because I'm always looking at my emails.
No, it was sent at least a day ago. At some point.
yeah, the second half was yesterday.
Yeah.
Oh,
So I'll try. I'll see what I can do. I really hope you, or unless I'll try sending it in small batches. Maybe it goes better with a small batch. Maybe the fact that it's so large, it's harder to download it. I don't really know the reason. You all have through page 5, I believe.
Yes.
Yes, you have through page 5. So let me try maybe sending 6 through 11, let's say, and see if you receive it. If you don't receive it, let me know. Karen, I'll see. I don't know.
Oh, I have
Okay,
17.
I mean, I once had.
I have through page 17.
Yeah,
Not
that's the full thing. If you
Oh,
have it 17, that's the whole packet.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, 'cause you said
Oh.
11.
So I was once working with Tamar on Google, and I had the same thing that she needed to allow me access. So I'm going to ask her.
Oh, and, right, yeah.
I'll ask her. And
Right, 'cause
also
even
my
Ju-
granddaughter, I once had that also.
Listen, the first time I was setting up this Zoom thing, I had to call my my grandson Akiva, who's he's now 17. We were 16. To help me because I, for the life of me, couldn't figure it out. And I remember saying to him,
sorry.
"You have to go very slowly with Grandma." She's
Right, right.
go step by step.
I know. Mike wants to show a movie in his class tomorrow, and he's got students in the class and students on Zoom. So we were practicing last night.
Right.
How do you show?
How do you
share the
format it?
screen? And-
So it's going to both the people who are present
Exactly.
and those who are. I know Yechiel teaches in the Jewish high school in Detroit, and he says it's really, because some of the times he's sitting, there's some kids in the class, but a lot of kids or parents have opted that they shouldn't come to school.
Yes.
So he really finds it's not easy at all
Not
to teach under those
not.
circumstances.
Yeah. And in college, they often don't show their faces, which
Oh, I know.
Mike hates,
Yeah.
and he
Well, I'm
asked-
doing that now. That's what I told you, like this one woman, whoever it is, but I don't see her face, so I don't know who it is.
Right, right.
And I can't figure out from those letters what that's standing for.
Right.
There could be even a man. Maybe he doesn't want to show his face. I don't know.
Malka, how would you compare the modern day Rabbanim with these unbelievable Rabbanim of the
Well, I think obviously they
12th
they
century?
received a lot more respect, I think, than perhaps modern day Rabbanim.
But are modern day Rabbanim as prolific? I mean, I know they're, I'm
Well,
saying,
don't forget, I am only telling you the most famous ones. There are definitely
Right.
others. That Sefer, for example, that I got this book from, the Rishonim. Oh my God, you should see how many names are listed in that book. Now I'm taking out the most well-known, or those who published something that then became generally accepted by Jews everywhere. So believe you me, there are hundreds. There are literally hundreds of other Rabbanim. These are the giants, from this. Don't forget, can you imagine a scholar to this day? They have to go through, in those days, all right, you look in the Gemara, you might have looked at perhaps a few things that came out of the Gaonic period, but then even as you're living into this medieval time, there are only certain key Sfarim available to you. But a
there's no
scholar
Google.
today, oh my God, he has to go back through layers and layers. I mean, to me, it's very daunting to
I love the grammarian, because
yes.
Dikduk is hard.
Oh, it's very difficult. I used to,
Very
the only way I mastered it, I had to memorize it, but I could do it. I could literally in my mind's eye see those charts. Up and
Right.
down.
But I guess they kept the 3-letter shoresh.
Yes, right. It was not two. Yeah,
Right.
It's mostly primarily three letters in a verb, or on occasion there are 4, but there are no, maybe on a rare occurrence you might have 2, but it's mostly
Bye-bye.
3.
Bye.
All right, everybody.
Okay.
Take care. Have a good week.
Okay.
All right. Oh,
You
Karen,
too, you
before
too.
I have the greatest news to share.